Hi everybody! The purpose of this video is to talk about the colonial people, the people who actually lived in the 13 English colonies. Before we move on, it's important to remember that there are 3 colonial regions: New England, which is purple on this map, the Mid-Atlantic, which is green on this map, and the Southern region, which is orange on this map. Different groups lived in different regions. There are some groups that lived throughout all 13 colonies, all 3 regions, but there are also some groups that maybe only lived in the southern region or only lived in New England based on what they needed in those regions. We're going to start by looking at the large landowners. Large landowners, also known as plantation owners, lived mostly in the South because that's where all of the really large pieces of land were located. They were very, very rich. They had a lot of money because they made money off of their plantations when they sold the cotton, tobacco, rice, and indigo that they grew on those plantations. They forced enslaved Africans and indentured servants to work on their fields. So they didn't do a lot of the physical manual labor of working on a farm, but they forced enslaved Africans and had indentured servants to do their work for them. The next group is small farmers. Small farmers lived mostly in the Mid-Atlantic region. In the South, you had big plantations that needed large landowners. And in New England, there weren't very many farms, aside from small family gardens. So the Mid-Atlantic is where most small farmers lived. They relied on their family to do all of the work on the farm. They did not sell most of their crops. For the most part, they just consumed the crops that they grew, or they gave it to their neighbors or sold a couple of things to their close neighbors. But for the most part, they weren't growing cotton and tobacco. They were growing things that they could consume, like grain or livestock, or other crops that you could eat. The next group are enslaved Africans. They were captured in Africa and brought over here. Remember, we learned about how the Portuguese explorers went to West Africa, and when they did, they captured Africans, enslaved them, and brought them to the New World. The enslaved Africans are mostly in the South on southern plantations. They are owned as property by plantation owners. They did not have any rights. The plantation owners considered them their property. They were treated extremely harshly. They were punished physically when plantation owners felt they didn't follow directions. They were not given very good clothing or very good food or very good places to live. Their treatment was incredibly harsh. And they were not allowed to learn how to read or write. They were not educated. It was actually against the law in most counties in the South to teach enslaved Africans how to read or write. The next group is artisans. An artisan lives pretty much anywhere in the 13 colonies. You can see from the map that they're in all 3 regions, and that's because all 3 regions needed artisans. This man in the picture is what you would call a blacksmith. A blacksmith is an example of a job that you might have as an artisan. Artisans were skilled in a craft. A craft is like something that you have to get really good at to be able to do. So like turning metal into different objects would be a craft, or creating furniture out of wood would be a craft, or creating chandeliers or barrels or shoes. These were all crafts that artisans became skilled in. They made money from their skill. Today in 2021, we have factories that will create the objects and goods that artisans made. But back then, you might have 1 or 2 artisans in a town, and the town relied on them to create the things that the town members needed. So they made a lot of money from their skill that they had. These are 4 examples, but there are lots and lots of examples of artisans. For examples are a blacksmith, or somebody who creates things out of metal, an apothecary, which would be like a pharmacist today, a cooper, which is somebody who makes barrels, and a printer. I don't mean like a printer like what you would buy at Staples. I mean a person who works as a printer. It was a very challenging job, and it was a very big, heavy machinery that they had to use in order to be a printer. Our next group is the merchants. And again, merchants are all over the 13 colonies because they were needed in all 3 regions and in all 13 colonies. Merchants were pretty wealthy. They were rich because they were the ones that were in charge of buying things from the ships that came in from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Africa. And they bought those goods, things like coffee and tea and chocolate and fabric and maybe some furniture that came from Europe. They would buy those goods and then sell them back to the colonists. It's not like today where we have Amazon and we can purchase whatever we want and it doesn't really matter where it comes from. Back then, if you got a piece of furniture from France, that would prove that you were really wealthy. So people wanted to buy these really expensive items like chocolate and furniture from France and other things from all over the world. So they were willing to pay merchants a lot of money for those goods. Our next group is the indentured servants. Indentured servants, again, were mostly in the South. They were a little bit in the Mid-Atlantic, but for the most part, they were in the southern region. These were people who wanted to live in the colonies, but they could not afford the passage to get over here. They couldn't afford the boat ticket to come across the Atlantic Ocean into the New World. So instead of never being able to come here or trying to find enough money for a boat ticket, they agreed to work for 5 to 7 years. So they would find a plantation owner, a large landowner, and have that person pay for their passage over to North America. And in return, they would agree to work for them for 5 to 7 years without pay. They were treated similarly to enslaved Africans, where they weren't paid for their work and they weren't respected. However, a major difference is that they wanted to come here and that they were free at the end of that 5 to 7 years. Our next group is women. Women, of course, are all over all 3 regions of the 13 colonies. And you can see from this image, this would have been a very, very wealthy family based on what you see at the kitchen. But you can see that the women are the ones that are responsible for cooking. This woman looks like she's rolling out maybe a pie crust. They're responsible for, again, cooking or doing things with medicine over the fire. They're responsible for weaving or making clothes for the family. This woman in the background is churning butter. It was not just you buy a stick of butter at Kroger back then. You had to actually churn the butter by hand. And all of them, all the women, are responsible for any children in the home. So women would have had a lot of responsibilities in the home. They were the homemakers. Again, they took care of the children of the family, and they had very little education. It was very rare that a woman was allowed to go off past maybe 3rd grade. They were taught to read and write, but only up until about 3rd grade, and it was rare that they were able to go on to middle school or high school or college. Our next group is free African Americans. Free African Americans are mostly in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. They could own their own land and they could earn money. So that's very different from enslaved Africans who were not allowed to own land and could not earn money. Free African Americans could do those things, but they also could not vote and they were discriminated against. So these are things that are similar to the way that enslaved Africans would have been treated. They were not allowed to vote, and discriminated is kind of like a fancy vocab word for not treated well, not respected. They were, even though they were free and they weren't considered property of a plantation owner, they still were not treated equally. Our last group are the children of the colonies, and your experience as a colonial child was very, very different depending on how wealthy your family was. If you were from a wealthy family, like if your father was a large landowner or maybe a really successful merchant or artisan, you would be educated and raised to take over the land or plantation or craft that your family was in charge of. The image you see here is probably a group of wealthy kids because they are out carefree playing. Maybe their lesson for the day is done, but not every child had this opportunity. If your family was from a poor family, like maybe your father had been an indentured servant and was free now, maybe your father or parents were really poor artisans who were not very successful or small farmers, you were working as a child. You did not have the opportunity to get an education. If you were born into slavery on a plantation, you were also forced to work, and just like your parents, it was without pay. That is it for this video. You can move on to your next activity.